Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first event of Activating Ideas. I'm Caterina Albano, a reader in visual cultures at Central St. Martin's University of the Arts and the coordinator of the visual program there. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event. Which aims to celebrate the work of doctoral research at Central St. Martin's, but capturing some of the work of students who are about to complete their PhD. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. Elizabeth Way, who is Associate Curator of Costume at the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, and a doctoral candidate with a PhD and project entitled Respectable: Fashion Curatorial Methodologies Explored Through an Exhibition on Black American Women's Respectability Discourse, 1865-1929. This evening, Liz is joined by Dr. Christine Checinska, who is the V&A inaugural Senior Curator of Africa and Diaspora Textiles and Fashion, and by Alistair O'Neill, who is a Professor of Fashion History and Theory at Central St. Martin's. And I would like to thank also Liam Green, who is helping with the running of this event and with the running of Activating Ideas, and has been a great pleasure to work with him. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Alistair, who will chair this evening in conversation event. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Katerina, for the kind introduction. Welcome all. This afternoon's in conversation will raise perspectives around fashion curating, looking particularly at the role of representation and social justice. So in response to the demands of contemporary social justice movements, to developments in critical theoretical frameworks for thinking around race and decolonization, to furthering debates around intersectional identities, gender and sexuality, and to illuminating the marginalized and the repressed, temporary exhibitions in museums and galleries globally have become a really important context to signal recent and vital shifts in the contemporary cultural landscape. And they also mark the changes in the policies and procedures of the cultural institutions that stage them. As an object of material culture warm close to the body, and as an ideology of change, fashion is well placed to raise such concerns. And recent fashion curating has reflected them through new avenues of inquiry. And I'm joined this afternoon by two fashion curators, Dr. Christine Checinska from the V&A, and also Elizabeth Way from MFIT in New York. Welcome to you both. It's really great that you can join me this afternoon. So this conversation in the Activating Ideas programme arises out of the fact, as Katerina has mentioned, that Elizabeth is completing a PhD at CSM concurrent to her professional duties as a practicing fashion curator. And Christine is here as she was interviewed by Liz as part of the project for curating the landmark exhibition Africa Fashion staged at the V&A last year. And whilst I'm chairing this conversation, I need to state that I'm also Liz's Director of Studies for her PhD, and that I supervise another PhD student with Christine in a collaborative doctoral partnership shared between CSM and the V&A. So disclosures out of the way, I'd like to begin by first asking Liz to explain her PhD project to us all, to kind of demonstrate how it raises the concerns of representation in the historical record, and how the project aligns with contemporary forms of social justice.
Thank you so much, Alistair. And thank you all for being with us here this evening. So a little bit about my PhD project. It's about curatorial methodology. And I really wanted to think about how we can document and also theorize ways of curating the fashion objects of marginalized people. And in my case, I use Black American women and Black diasporic people more generally as a case study within this project. So I really pull methodology from three sources. I look at history, the study of history, particularly the work of Michel Rolfe Trio, who looks at examining the archive and tracing power in the archive, as well as other historians such as Sadia Hartman, who thinks a little bit about speculation and the way we can, pull information out of the archive when it's not necessarily there. So I merge these theoretical, historiographical theories with existing fashion scholarship. So Carol Tulloch's work, her methodology of the African diaspora, and our style narratives have been really important. And I kind of use this as a framework to think about kind of the fashion studies theories that we are more familiar with, Irving Goffman, Judith Butler, for example, and thinking how we can adjust these to think more critically about the fashion objects of marginalized people. But I also pull methodology from a set of exhibitions that were current during my research, so 2022 to 2023, and all of these exhibitions looked at Black identities in some way. Africa Fashion was a really pivotal one because it looks specifically at fashion, but the other ones, and we have a couple of slides here of these exhibitions, they also integrated fashion to some extent. They were art and history exhibitions. And I really look at them for specific ways of curating that contemporary curators are enacting in their practice. So when we pull up the first slide, you'll see one of the methods that I identified is renaming. Uh, this is from an exhibition called Textures that was in Kent State, Ohio. So you see here, and this is a historic bust that the curators very specifically renamed in the exhibition. So that's a methodology that I look at. In the next slide, you'll see this is from an exhibition called Queens of the Heartland, which was also in Ohio that focused on 30 Black women who were participating in activist movements. And this was a really interesting exhibition to think about the organization of information. As you can see from these panels, there was a lot of information on offer in this exhibition, years representing years of research. And so the curator really pulled on social media, organizational structures to kind of organize this information, which I found really interesting. And so, besides the historiography and current exhibitions, the third source I pull methodology from is the work of artists. So, I looked at two specific artists. In the next slide, you'll see the work of Elizabeth Columba, who is both of these artists really utilize historic fashion in really central ways in their work. And so I pull out their art making strategies to think about how curators can apply these strategies to really make exhibitions more emotive and connect with audiences. In the next slide, you'll see the second artist that I looked at, which was Fabiola Jean-Louis. So I took all of these methodologies from these three sources and I test them in my thesis in a hypothetical exhibition, a proposed exhibition. It's called Respectable, and it deals with Black American women and their relationship with respectability politics, which was a discourse that was really centered around this idea of model behavior from Black populations as a way to kind of mitigate racial discrimination. But it was really important for this proposed exhibition for me to focus around a discourse because a lot of this methodological work is really focused on kind of pulling out perspectives and ideas and discourses within historic marginalized populations, really a step beyond kind of proving that they existed. To have their work in galleries, have their objects in galleries and prove that they existed is one thing, but to kind of dig deeper into their discourses and their very personal perspectives is something that I am really aiming for in this project. So in the next couple of slides, you'll see some of the objects that I work with to build this proposed exhibition. There's 9 in total. This, for example, is a dress in the collection of the Wadsworth Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. It's worn by a woman named Rebecca Primus, who was a teacher and an abolitionist. And in the next slide, you'll see a photograph. So I work with fashion objects like you saw before, photographs. This is from Atlanta, Georgia. And then in the next one, you'll see a fashion text. So these are the 3 fashion objects that I look at. This is an etiquette book called The Color Girl Beautiful, which is really all about propagating respectability politics. So the goal of my work is to document curatorial methods and see how history and art can really influence fashion curatorial methodologies, as well as these contemporary ways of curating that have been demonstrated by working curators. And so the purpose is to not only document these methods, which isn't very kind of common in fashion curating scholarship, but also to demonstrate this proposed exhibition as a practice-based tool. So those are the kind of prongs of this project that work towards curatorial methods that help audiences connect with historic marginalized people and really create empathy and understanding. So that is my project in a nutshell.
Thanks, Liz. That's a really cogent kind of overview of the project as it stands. Yeah, so this is a project that's proposing an exhibition that you hope to raise post PhD, but it's also an engagement with the contemporary culture of fashion exhibition making, and you spoke about the 4 case studies that you've looked at, one of which involved Christine in relation to her exhibition Africa Fashion. I wonder, Christine, if I could start by asking you what it was like to be approached by Liz to be interviewed, about your practice, and to ask you, I suppose, more broadly about how fashion curators discuss and engage around ideas of their practice, and how they take abstract concepts, let's say, and working through objects make them meaningful in exhibition display.
Do you know, it was so interesting to hear you, Liz, speak about your work around methodology, and it was lots of thoughts about my own methodology was sort of coming to mind. And it was wonderful when we did speak, when you interviewed me for your research, because I think it is so important for us as curators to be able to speak about our work, because there's so much that we delve into, whether that's the theories that underpin what we're about to do or the method that we want to engage, that is not always very apparent to an audience. And in fact, you don't really want it necessarily to be apparent to the audience. You want the audience to experience a certain thing. And, you know, I think elegant exhibitions almost seem as though they've happened by magic. You know, they have a kind of harmony to it. It's rather like designing a collection, but there's a lot of hard work and a lot of peddling that goes on underneath this kind of swan-like elegance of some exhibitions. So it was really vital, I think. It's vital for all of us to talk about our methodology. Speaking to you really allowed me to also share something about my positionality, and I think that that's really important in contemporary curation. This idea of everything that we do is always positioned, and I think in years gone by that wasn't necessarily acknowledged. So for me, my positionality was important. And one of the stories that I will share was we did have a kind of collaborative approach in terms of developing the research and development part of Africa Fashion. And one of the things that we did do was to have a community advisory panel. And by the time we met with the community panel, you know, the curatorial narrative was sketched out, and we went to the panel with specific questions about voice. And how are we going to write about and speak about this topic? How are we going to tell the story in the exhibition in written ways? And anyway, it was during this conversation that I was basically advised quite loudly by the group that it was really important for me to almost be outed as a curator of colour. And so that's how the forward, if people went to Africa Fashion in London, there was a forward in which I spoke about my own positionality, the fact that I have lived experience being of the African diaspora, lived experience being someone that designed in the British fashion industry, but also the research background. It also allowed us as an institution to name our colonial past and to name our ambitions for exhibitions like Africa fashion that are more than exhibitions. It's about building our collection, for example, and building relationships with African diaspora audiences. So that was something that we've never done before as an organisation, and it's not something that I would have done. But it's interesting that hearing you use the word or the term marginalised, Liz, because it's not a term I would necessarily have used, but certainly our guiding principle on Africa fashion was to approach the narrative from multiple and varied African perspectives. So really kind of centering Black and African voices and people, including myself. And I always feel that the view from the margin is somehow clearer than the view from the centre, right? So for me, it was about kind of almost metaphorically placing ourselves on the African continent as a team and looking at the rest of the world from that point. And that really shifted the narrative, the way that we told the story. It helped us to kind of edit, because, you know, like building a fashion collection, I think that these exhibitions are as much about what you edit out as what you keep in. But to have that kind of guiding principle of actually, no, we are not the marginalised. For this moment, the world centres around the African continent. And of course, at the V&A, there is no Africa gallery or Africa department. But for the 9 months of Africa Fashion, that was the Africa gallery at the V&A. And I think that really sort of shifted our methodology. And it shifted, I think it gave the collection, the exhibition a particular character. But I think as well, if I think about this, the types of, I love your breakdown of your looking at methods in terms of how to build collections. And I realise I do, sorry, you can tell my design past. I should out myself as a former designer, which is why I often relate things to my design life, because I think that that's something that I bring to fashion curation. I bring that kind of ability to tell stories through the visual, primarily through objects, to create displays that make the heart beat a little faster. And I think that comes from my designer eye, if you will. And I kind of combine that with my own PhD research, which was heavily rooted in post-colonial studies. Again, this idea of the view from the margin being clearer comes from my background and my grounding in post-colonial studies. So people like Homi Bhabha and the idea of the in-between being the space that you want to set up home in, because it's the space of creativity. It's also the space where you can be quite critical. And in the past, I've kind of described my method, and I did apply this to Africa fashion. I described it as a kind of carnivalized approach that drew on post-colonial studies, drew on race studies, drew on literature, rather like you, Liz. I tend to always inhabit art exhibitions because I'm a firm believer in newness can sometimes come from, you know, a discipline other than your own, and you bring back what you learn. So this idea of a carnivalized theoretical approach, I think, allows you to speak about diasporic cultures, diasporic cultural expressions, because being in diaspora is about inhabiting that in-between space. So I think in this kind of flurry of exhibitions that are now focusing on Black subjects, or the Black subject, often from an external objectifying gaze, Africa fashion is about kind of looking and seeing the world through the eyes of Black and African fashion practitioners, whether that's the vernacular, if you think about the family portraits, or the professional designers that we showcased work by in the exhibition. And you can see the Africa fashion mannequin there. That was something that, it was wonderful speaking to Liz about the thinking behind that, and the way that we, at the start of the project, knew that we wanted to give our audiences a glimpse of the diversity of the continent, the diversity of people, as well as the diversity of aesthetics within the fashion system. And so we set about working with the model Adele Ball, who at that time was emerging. So she's the face of the Africa fashion mannequins. We knew that we wanted to give a glimpse of the different hair textures, different skin tones. And so we worked with our internal staff network of people of colour, the Global Narratives Network, and we literally had workshops where we would have them, invite them in and have them vote on the types of hairstyles and textures that they felt represented them, vote on the skin tone representations that they felt represented them. So everything that you see in Africa fashion, the proportion of the 4 different skin tones absolutely reflected the outcomes of those workshops and surveys. So it was a real sort of lesson in drawing on expertise within the museum as well as expertise outside the museum, whether that's research expertise or its lived experience expertise. So again, this idea of the sort of carnivalized approach to a diasporic topic. I hope that that kind of answers, it's a very long answer to the question, but it's a very exciting thing to be talking about.
No, it's great, Christine. You know, you talk so eloquently about your positionality in relation to the exhibition and you being forced out, as it were, through debate to stand up and be counted. I just wondered as how you feel about it, because I know we've spoken about your own positionality in relation to the PhD, but has it made you more aware of your own position in terms of your work at MFIT?
Well, when I read that forward in the Africa Fashion Exhibition, I'd never read anything like that. And I was really struck by it because it so directly addressed kind of the history of the institution. At MFIT, we're not quite as old, and we are, you know, we're a very small museum. But it really did make me think about this curiosity that audiences have about who's curating these shows. And for so long I feel like there was this idea that, you know, it was an institutional voice or an objective voice, but I do think that there's room for curators to, you know, think about their positionality and communicate that to the audience, because I do think that they are interested in that.
Can I come back on that? Because once the forward was in place, it meant that we could, or when I was writing, I wrote in the first person. So some of the gallery text is written in the first person, and it's kind of very clear that it's my voice representing a Black and African voice. And that was something we'd never done before, experimenting with the first person in appropriate places. Because nothing is ever, you know, everything is positioned. There is no neutral voice in any institution.
I mean, one thing that I react to in reading that intro panel, walking into the first room, what sparked for me was the very active sense that these were your choice of objects, that it flowed from you. Is that something you wanted the audience to kind of feel?
I don't think I thought too much about it. I didn't think about it in that way, but I knew that all we would ever be able to tell was a small strand of this big story, big complex history and complex story of contemporary African fashion. So I think it allowed us to show our audience that this is a selection and there's so much more to see. And then in the structuring of the exhibition, ending with the Global Africa section, which was talking about the digital world and how at the click of a switch or at the click of a mouse, you can enter the buzz of the contemporary scene and do more research yourself. So I think you're right, Alistair. It did flag the fact that this is someone's selection, or it's someone leading a team to make this selection. And we were a team of, 2 main people with 3 others, and we would have our kind of weekly selection meetings of what pieces would go in. But it really kind of personalised, I think, the selection of objects. You're right.
Yeah. And I suppose thinking beyond the kind of scope of a temporary exhibition and thinking about working in the context of a museum. Sorry, that's my lights going out in the background. I wanted to ask you both a kind of general question about the museum being a site of contestation. It's not a neutral space to work in. It's not a white cube or a tabula rasa. It's I think, scholarship in recent years around the museums and gallery sector have really kind of traced the inequality, the prejudice, and the kind of oppression at the root of many museum histories. I think Black Atlantic, that was staged at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge last year, is a really good example of that. Not only kind of offering a kind of a critique of institutional inquiry, but also telling the backstory of the museum's development in relation to the slave trade, but also pointing to how that kind of legacy can be partly answered by curatorial interventions and artistic strategies. I suppose what I want to ask you both is, why do you think the site of the museum is so important for being able to communicate these kinds of concepts?
Well, I think for me, I approach it more as an audience member because at MFIT we are, I think we date back to the 70s and we started as a design lab, and certainly we have institutional kind of prejudices and policies that have affected the way we've curated and collected. But in here in New York, I think a lot about institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art that did a
Sure.
very small exhibition about its kind of its early donors and founders and its connection to the slave trade. Or even we have the Harlem Renaissance exhibition that just opened, and there are so many comparisons to one that happened, I believe, in the 60s or 70s that was not as that people didn't really like. And as an audience member, going into an institution and seeing an exhibition and having them be so honest about their curatorial past, their collecting past, it just reads as so much more authentic to me, because I do have those feelings when I walk into an exhibition, when I walk into an institution, especially a really old one. You go to the British Museum and you see the Elgin marbles, and I want to know, what does the British Museum have to say about this? So it's always really refreshing when I see that point of view come across.
I agree. I mean, it's really interesting, the kind of discovery, and I'm deliberately saying discovery, the discovery of the power of displays and exhibitions to agitate and to trouble and to raise questions and so on. Because I think as people of colour, we've always felt that, what's happening now is what we've always known and what we've always felt. As you say, Liz, going into the British Museum, it's a very personal story, but I remember taking my mother, my Jamaican mother, to the British Museum, and I can't actually remember what she saw. I think it might have been something that was Egyptian, just in the doorway, and she was really quite traumatized. We had to leave, and she's not a museum person, she wasn't an artist, but she felt really strongly. She wanted to question why those objects were in the British Museum. How did they end up there? Shouldn't they go back to, and this is my elderly mother, and I thought I was doing something. It was a lovely little tourist trip to the British Museum, I thought, lovely innocent little thing to do. But I think that as people of colour, we know that our history is bound up with these cathedrals of colour and these sort of palatial buildings. We know, I've got a cup of coffee here on my desk. We know that our history is bound up with the cup of coffee that we all drink, or the tea, or the sugar, and so on. So we know all of this. And I think there's power in that. There's power in buildings like the V&A, institutions like the V&A, being able to name and own these integrated stories, these interwoven histories. And I think that museums should be safe places to have debate around an object. If you think about, I think for me, that's always been the kind of beauty of fashion and textiles. It's their accessibility. So you can sort of tell a story from a textile object far more easily, I think, than you might do from a painting or a sculpture, where someone, member of the audience or member of the public, might think, well, I don't know anything about the history of art, I can't relate to that. Whereas fashion and textiles, that's the power. So I think that there's something really special that happens in institutions that draw out everyday things or material culture like fashion and textiles, or even thinking about the Fitzwilliam show and works like Barbara Walker's drawings, where she spent a lot of time rendering the garments. I think there's an accessibility there that perhaps doesn't happen in other situations with other art forms. And it's something that we can really kind of embrace, I think, as fashion and textile scholars. So, I think museums and the displays that are now emerging can hold a mirror up to history, a critical mirror to history and also to the present day. But absolutely, museums like mine should be spaces where we can safely debate controversial or seemingly controversial issues, because actually sometimes they're not controversial to everyone.
Yeah, just hearing you speak about this idea of a critical mirror, Christine, it really makes me think of the recent exhibition at Somerset House, The Missing Thread, that looked at the lack of black and brown representation and account of post-war and contemporary British fashion history. And I think it was a really important moment in fashion curation in London, particularly that went on, and it makes me think about the kind of flip side of representation, not in the sense of what's represented in the frame, but what's not there, or what sits outside of the frame. And I wanted to ask you both about what kind of strategies or methodologies or practices can a fashion curator employ to bring out the presence of what is missing in an account. Liz, I wonder if I could come to you first.
It's really interesting. I think it's really interesting to think about, like, how do you represent what's not there? And I recently contributed to an exhibition book for the Women Dressing Women exhibition at the Met. And my chapter was about this idea of absence and omission when it comes to women, specifically Black women. Fashion designers. And so I talk about, like, resources other than extant clothing, photographs being a really big one, but also, newspaper articles, even going back to, runaway slave ads for self-emancipated people, and all of these ways we can find out this fashion information. And the curators took, I focus a lot on a designer named Zelda Wynne Valdez, who did all these really beautiful stage costumes for people like Eartha Kitt and Dorothy Dandridge and Mae West. And so the curators used an image of Joyce Bryant in a Zelda Wynne Valdez dress, and they printed it on a mirror as part of the exhibition design. And they had a label to go with it that talks about how a lot of this material culture is missing, but how we can still study this designer and how we should still know about her presence. And so I saw the exhibition twice, and I didn't necessarily see people kind of engage with that graphic or that text. Not, I mean, I'm sure there are people who did. I don't know if it kind of blended into the exhibition design or anything. So I'm not quite sure how successful that was as a methodology, but I really appreciated it. And when I was in the gallery alone and looking at it, I really loved this idea of this mirror, because you can see her work and then see yourself and see the rest of the gallery reflected into this image. But I'd have to speak to kind of everyday interpreted it.
I think when you have an illuminated object on display that has visual authority, it's very powerful, and it makes it very hard for an absence to kind of hit in the same kind of way in visual terms. What's your experience, Christine?
I agree with you, Liz. I think there's an awful lot of kind of almost reading between the lines, or being really sort of creative about your sources, whether it's letters or it's film or it's conversation. I'm always really struck by what I think in all of my work, oral testimonies or conversations have been really central, because particularly when you think about global Africa, we come from oral traditions. So, things are not necessarily written down. So for me, I think having the conversations around the objects you do have, or conversations, whether that object is a garment or a letter or a receipt or whatever it is, feels really important. In Africa Fashion, we opened our Vanguard section, the 20th century design section, with a piece made by an unnamed dressmaker, to sort of mark that part of the global African fashion system that's in the hands of the corner dressmaker or tailor, that whose names were not written down. So there are sort of interesting techniques that you can adopt to acknowledge and be really kind of transparent about those absences, because we're never truly absent. It's a really wonderful conversation I had with the designer Highland Booker, who some people may know, Liz is nodding, who was head of design at Worth during the 60s, and he's African American. And he said to me, "Do we write the history we want or the history that was?" Because of course, if you pick up any book on Worth, he's missing. And yet, if you look at the newspaper articles that were coming out when he became the head of the House of Worth, they're all really celebratory. He's named, you see his designs. So it's really interesting, this idea. I mean, I think we almost inhabit an absent presence. We're kind of there, but we have a shadowy presence in a sense, which is why I love your idea, what you're sharing about the mirror. I haven't seen that show, but I find that really interesting, the idea of mirrors and shadows and ways of tracing presence.
What's also important about the device of the mirror in the exhibition space is it raises the image of the visitor within the display. And it leads me on to my final question, really, which is about the principle of participation in exhibitions in general, but fashion exhibitions in particular, as a device or a method for drawing visitors in, not as passive spectators, but as kind of active contributors. And the example that it makes me think of was a show at the Cooper in New York in 2021 about Willie Smith, or the Willie Wear brand, that created a kind of legacy for the wider community of creatives and consumers who were invested in the work of Smith, by creating a kind of digital community archive that people could contribute to as part of visiting the exhibition, reflecting on it afterwards. But also it's still there, it's up and it's online as a continuing resource. So I just wanted to ask you both about how fashion curators might go about empowering visitors, and what role storytelling might play within that.
One way that I think might be slightly controversial is when we think about contemporary fashion exhibitions, you can point, not necessarily that we want to tell the visitors to buy these things, but these are designers who are working, who are selling their objects and who are selling their clothes. They're not museum objects, they're clothes. And, if they are engaging in the types of stories and the types of narratives that the curator is, kind of pointing to, and that the audience can resonate with, they can go and buy those things and support those designers. That can't really happen with almost any other type of exhibition. So I think that's a really interesting way. And exhibitions are an opportunity, for designers to tell their stories, and maybe show how they engage in things like sustainability or fair labor or other things that audience members might really connect to. And I don't know that I would ever kind of link to a commerce site or something like that in my exhibition, but I think that's a really kind of unspoken kind of way of participation when it comes to at least contemporary fashion exhibitions.
That's so interesting, because in our Global Africa section, we did have, there was the Industry Africa moment, which was controversial. We didn't realise that this would feel controversial to, some members at the V&A, because it wasn't about advertising Industry Africa. It was more sharing Industry Africa, because it's more of a cultural hub than an e-tailer. Yes, you can buy clothes, but it's also about educating. It's about connecting consumers with designers. It's about educating consumers about where things are made and so on and so on. So it's interesting. We kind of dipped our toe into that idea in Africa Fashion with our Industry Africa section. But to come back to what you were saying, Alistair, about storytelling, I think I've already said that we come from oral traditions, and I think that for me feels very important. Thinking about the idea of social justice and what does social justice actually mean? I felt I just quickly looked at what social justice means, because we sort of use it as a phrase all the time at the moment. Everyone's talking about fashion and social justice, or creativity and social justice. But if social justice is this idea of a fair balance in terms of the distribution of wealth and opportunities, I literally just typed that in, and privileges, I think that participation and storytelling that we see coming through current exhibitions, I think they literally do demonstrate this move towards social justice. Whether that's through co-design or focus groups or the call outs or as you described, the digital legacy of exhibitions or digital exhibitions. So in Brooklyn, for example, Brooklyn Museum, the Africa Fashion exhibition there, they had so many people respond to the public call out for images and objects that they then had almost a separate sort of companion show online of, you know, audience members' responses to come and share your fashion stories. So I think that these things are literally kind of demonstrating a move towards social justice. If social justice is about equal opportunities and privileges, if you like, and a real kind of democratization. But I do want to say a little bit of a caveat, because I think someone's still got to steer the ship. So I think bringing it back to the role of the curator, it really isn't about a free-for-all. Someone's got to be steering the ship and guiding the thing. So I think the curator's role has, you know, it's constantly changing, but I think with this idea of the democratization of the art space and fashion galleries, our roles have changed again.
But the role has changed, but it is a necessary role.
It's necessary, 100%. Yeah,
yes.
to get that across. Yeah.
Well, look, talking about participation, I think this is a really good moment to open it up to questions. I don't know if we've had any, Liam, in the chat. I can't see any myself. But if anybody wants to ask a question, we can all turn our cameras on. That would be great. Hi, Marketa.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, hi, Liz, and congratulations on nearly completing your PhD. I can't believe you've done it so quickly and efficiently. But I remember your application, and it was so stellar that it actually isn't that surprising. But the question I want to ask you, you showed us some images of, you know, from fine art, and you talked about how you used artistic strategies to think about curatorial strategies. And I had something on my mind looking at those images, but actually, could you tell us a little bit more about how this panned out for you?
Absolutely. So the thing that struck me about these two artists, and these were really kind of choices I made because they engaged so much with historic fashion, but these were just pieces of art that I connected with so strongly as an audience member, as a fashion historian. So I really look at the way they use fashion. So, for example, contrast and symbolism are two ways that these different artists really draw on fashion to make an immediate connection to the audience. I think one reason why they pay so much attention to historic fashion is that it immediately takes the audience where they want to be in terms of time and place. So it's really kind of pulling out methodologies like that. They each have their own kind of ways of talking about it. For example, Elizabeth Columba talks about unloading the baggage, and that's kind of her methodology of placing these Black subjects. And in the two paintings I looked at, she painted real women, models who appeared in, early 19th and mid 19th century paintings. For example, the woman who appears in Olympia by Manet is one of the women she paints. So she talks about unloading the baggage of these original images through their clothing and setting in her new paintings. And then Fabiola Jean-Louis refers to her practice as time traveling. So she thinks about the ways that she can bring these audience members back in time through, and mostly through the clothing, a little bit through the setting. So it's really kind of pulling out more of these abstract strategies that they have and thinking about how curators can use those.
Great. Thanks, Marketa. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, yes.
Serena, hi there.
Hi guys. It's been a great talk. Really, really interesting. I'm really interested in how you both decide on what pieces to use when you actually curate an exhibition. Because I can imagine that when you're doing the research stage, there's so much to look at and research. What makes you think, yes, this is a piece?
I'll let you go first, Christine.
Oh, thank you for that. It's interesting because I think there are so many different ways that this can be done. I think for me, I had a sense of the story first and then the objects. And there's a bit of toing and froing, but it definitely happened that way around. Whereas I know for some people, it's an object or a group of objects that then opens out into the exhibition. So yeah, I had a story in mind and some guiding principles that underpin that story. The story was about impact, for example. So in the contemporary floor, it had to be those designers. We had to select from a pool of designers that we felt were having global impact at the time. So it's really kind of looking at the story, how you're going to tell the story. And it is as much about editing. I think, as I mentioned before, it's about leaving things out. Which is interesting, I think, because as curators of colour, I think sometimes there's the danger of the scarcity mentality where we think, oh my goodness, we're never going to get another opportunity. So we load too many things in, you know. So sort of beware of that, I would say. But this, for me, the story came first. How about you, Liz?
I would definitely say that the curatorial narrative is something that guides the object choice. But when I'm just doing in the most preliminary stages, when I'm thinking about objects, I'm really drawn to collections, designers who have a really deep story to go with their objects. If it's an interesting story, if it's an interesting source of inspiration that I can tie to wider trends, I'm always drawn to that. But then I'm also guided by aesthetics. I do want things that have a lot of impact in a gallery. And, you know, I'll always pick if there's two of them, I'll always pick the brighter colored one versus the black one, things like that. And then also we have limitations of, you know, can we actually get this into the museum in the time frame that we need? So all of those kind of go into it. But I'm definitely drawn to, like, if the object has a really great story or a great history, that always is really attractive for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one observation that I would make is I was really interested, Christine, when you spoke about the kind of backstory of an exhibition, the kind of endless research that sits behind something which is visually effortless. And it reminded me of working with Liz on a PhD where you're writing out your object biographies, and we decided that we'd put them into the appendix, and then we realized that the appendix was way longer than the actual main body of text. And then we realized that it was actually because you're a fashion curator, and there is always this huge long tail of research behind what is quite a modest display, looking at it, you know, frontally. How have you found that, Liz? You know, has it taught you something about your own practice?
In theory, I'm very much in favor of short exhibition labels. I don't want to overload the audience member. And as an audience member, I don't particularly like very long exhibition labels. But I find that when I'm actually writing labels, it is so hard to keep them short, because I find, especially because of the types of objects I'm drawn to, there's so many stories I want to tell about them. And you know, I have to be so disciplined, and I always need an outside eye to help. I need to be so disciplined about keeping to the exhibition narrative, keeping it tight. And, you know, sometimes you just have to let go of like these really interesting stories that you want to incorporate into the labels. So it's a struggle always to keep my writing short.
Yeah, I have the same problem because I agree with you. I think it's the thing that catches the eye, but it has to have multiple stories behind it. So then when you get asked to write 50 words on this thing that has, you know, you could write an encyclopedia with the research you've done, but you've then got to boil it down to the 50 word, what are the key things? If you come back to the curatorial narrative, I guess, and then that helps you to edit down. But that is hard. That is hard, cutting the words.
Thank you both. Do we have any other questions?
While we wait for the next question, I have a question for Christine, if that's okay. I wanted to ask, you know, Africa fashion, I saw it in London, I saw it in Brooklyn, and I know that it's traveling further. How have you been able, have you had to kind of let go of the exhibition as it kind of travels to different venues? I know it was slightly different in Brooklyn, and, you know, I'm sure it's different in the different venues. Like, what has that process been like?
It's interesting because it's, you know, I work so closely with the curators of the host museums. So with Ernestine, we were having regular meetings because the space was so much bigger. She was able to add more. So sections like the Cultural Renaissance section is a wonderful case in point, I think, because visualizing the show in London before going down to the what was a tiny space, in my mind's eye, I had pictured this wonderful space, this large space that was all about the cultural Renaissance. Because for me, with my post-colonial studies PhD, for me, the cultural renaissance was really, really important. But then in London, we had one case for the cultural renaissance section. But then the beauty of the Brooklyn space, it was so much bigger. Ernestine was able to do the whole room. And so it's been an interesting process because certain sections expand and are perhaps closer to my original vision for Africa fashion than what we were able to do in London. So there are very practical discussions and thought processes around space and what you can physically fit in a space. So I've been working. So now I'm working with. I worked with Portland in the same way, looking at their space. How does the story play out in their space? Melbourne, I think, has been announced. So I'm off to Melbourne in May to do the final week of install. They have a big space, which is lovely, but we're going for a slightly different aesthetic in Melbourne. So that's been quite interesting. And I did have to let go of a bit there, if I'm honest. And then I thought, well, hang on, this is 2 years on from the original. And actually I like this design. It's really interesting. And so the palette that they use is inspired by one of the images in the Africa Fashion book. So it's kind of still telling the story in a similar way, but it will look and feel quite a little bit more white cube, I would say. Spoiler alert, Africa Fashion is a bit white cube. So it's been an interesting process, but I can feel it's not that I'm letting go, but you have to kind of really sort of embed yourself in this new space and the new audience, what works with the new audience.
Okay, so do we have any final questions?
I have a final question if I may.
Yes, go ahead, Katerina.
Thank you, and thank you, Liz and Christina, for this fascinating conversation. My question is around the kind of objects that you unearth during your curatorial research, and how do you deal with the gaps in trying to know about the subject and to find out about their narratives, sort of this narrative that somehow seems to be the narratives that have been silenced.
Do you want to go first, Christine?
I'm still thinking actually, because I'm trying to think of a concrete example of surprises in Africa fashion and things that were unearthed. I mean, I have one example it's kind of, I think, speaking to your question. It's not Africa fashion. It was one of my other shows, which was a much more personal show, and it's called The Arrivant. You can find it online. And what was interesting and surprising to me was more around people's reactions, not so much around what was missing, but more, I had no sense. So this show was based more closely on my PhD research. And I didn't really appreciate the way that this story that was essentially a story of Jamaican arrival could speak to audiences so powerfully in a Johannesburg situation. So I think there are unexpected things for me around the way that our work can be read. And that's a wonderful thing. So new stories emerge as audiences engage with something. So the story that we're trying to tell is not necessarily the story that's always taken away, and there can be some wonderful surprises in that. And I think for me with The Arrivants, I just remember at the private view, someone coming over and she was crying because she said, well, this is my family story. And I almost didn't know what to do with that, because for me it was something rooted in my own family history, but I didn't appreciate the impact or how something could speak to someone else from another culture in that powerful way. And out came more stories. And so that body of work then changed. So I think you have to have a kind of a fluidity, I think, when you're working, and be open to the unexpected. And I think as well, open to the ambiguous. But for me, that's what creativity is about, isn't it? It's about being open to ambiguity. I don't know whether I've fully answered, but that's what came to mind, so I thought I would share it. Liz, over to you.
Well, one of the things I wanted to say about Africa fashion, when you in the section with when you showed all the beautiful textiles, I loved that, like, if you didn't necessarily know the name of the maker, you would list the
Mm,
culture, the specific culture that
mm,
it came from, or you would talk about the person who commissioned it and how they wore it. And I've been to, other exhibitions, in other contexts where textiles might be in more kind of what we might think of as an ethnographic context. And so often it's just like unknown maker, 19th century. It's just like these very wide dates. And I loved how Africa fashion really went for this specificity to really make you think about who made this, who wore this, what context it was made in. So in terms of kind of filling in the gaps of the absences, I thought that was really beautifully done. Um, for my PhD work, something that I'm kind of experimenting with in my proposed exhibition is to think about kind of perhaps this was worn in this context. We know all of these things about this woman. And so perhaps, we know this woman was very religious. She has this beautiful dress. Maybe she wore this to church. Maybe this was in, a Black community after she gained her freedom and she was building this new identity through her church community. So that's something that I'm working with, not necessarily something I've done in my actual curatorial work, but I
mm,
hope to kind of maybe incorporate um, in the future because I think it's important for audiences to kind of imagine what this object would have been doing in its real life. Even and in plausible ways, if not necessarily 100% factually backed up ways.
mm. That's interesting because I'm really interested in the idea of performance and how performance can again flesh out these missing stories, and the idea of speculation, but perhaps it's done through spoken word. I find that really interesting. Mm. I can feel a new show coming on now. I think
Great.
Liz and I need to brew an idea
It's going to be
together.
called ambiguity, possibility, and speculation.
Yes.
So,
Well,
so,
I'll wait for it.
so before we finish, can I just ask Christine and Liz to just advertise upcoming projects so that we can keep abreast of what's going on? I know it doesn't sound like you've quite left Africa fashion yet,
Mm,
Christine, but if you can
mm.
just give us an idea of some of the projects you're building towards.
Yes, one of the things that I find myself returning to more and more is textiles and fibre art. So um, I've got on the 10th of April, I have Entangled Threads, which is a talk event at the Stuart Hall Library, and it celebrates the 10th anniversary of the Clothes, Cloth and Culture Group. So that's a key thing that's coming up. I'm also speaking at the Beau Brummel conference. I think it's
Great.
the dress historian. So again, returning to my masculinities, black masculinities work. So those are the two things I've got coming up shortly. Thanks.
Great. And can I just ask, will the Entangled Threads talk be online as well as in person?
It's in person, but I think it will be recorded, and we're hoping to do a series of 3. So if
Great.
people missed that one, do look out for them. They'll be coming up over the coming months.
Lovely. And Liz?
I'm currently working on an exhibition called Africa's Fashion Diaspora that's all about kind of these international, transnational conversations about Black culture and how fashion designers are contributing to it. And it'll open at the Museum at FIT in September, and then there's a book to accompany it. Christine wrote an amazing chapter on Highland Booker in the book, so that's something else she has coming out too.
Yes, yes, lovely Highland. I know. His story is just amazing. So do look out for Highland Booker if you've never come across him before. Wonderfully elegant man, wonderful story about his time at work.
Great. Well, I think that's all. So thank you all for listening in. Thank you to Christine and to Liz for a wonderful conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to Katerina and to Liam for organising the event so smoothly. So I think that's all for now. Thank you all and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.